The rain in Seattle didn't wash things clean. It just made everything heavier. It was a relentless, gray sheet that hammered against the floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass of the aerospace executive boardroom, blurring the city lights into smeared streaks of neon and despair. 40 stories up, the storm was silent, reduced to a visual chaotic backdrop for a room that was terrifyingly still. The air inside was scrubbed, recycled, and chilled to a temperature that felt less like comfort and more like preservation. It smelled of lemon polish, expensive leather, and the ozone scent of high-voltage ambition. Elias Thorne sat at the far end of a mahogany table that was long enough to land a Cessna on. He kept his hands on his knees, gripping the fabric of his trousers to stop them from trembling. Not from fear, he told himself, but from a rage he was struggling to metabolize. At 60 years old, Elias felt the weight of gravity more than he used to. His joints ached with the dampness radiating from the window, and his eyes, which had scanned horizons from 30,000 feet for 4 decades, now felt gritty and tired as they fixated on the single, thin document resting in the center of the table. Safety certification, Horizon X900. It looked innocuous. Just 20 pages of bonded paper, stapled neatly at the corner, waiting for the final blessing. Beside it lay a fountain pen, black lacquer and gold trim, uncapped and pointing at Elias like a loaded barrel. "It's just ink, Elias," Marcus Vane said. Vane stood by the window, his back to the room, watching the storm drown the city. The CEO of aerospace was a study in modern power. A bespoke suit that cost more than Elias's first car, a posture of relaxed predation, and a voice that was smooth, cultivated, and utterly devoid of warmth. He didn't turn around when he spoke. He didn't have to. The room was designed to amplify his authority. "Ink dries," Elias replied, his voice raspy. He hadn't slept in 3 days, not since the last simulation run. "Blood doesn't." Vane turned then, a slow pivot that was practiced and theatrical. He walked toward the table, his footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. He looked like a man who had never known a moment of uncertainty in his life. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table, opposite Elias, and sat down, lacing his fingers together. "You're being dramatic," Vane said, a faint, patronizing smile playing on his lips. "We've been over the data. The oversight committee is happy. The shareholders are ecstatic. The military has a $20 billion contract sitting on a desk at the Pentagon, waiting for a call that says the X900 is ready to fly. The only thing standing between this company and the next 50 years of aviation dominance is your signature on that dotted line." Elias looked at the document. He didn't see the text. He saw the simulator. He closed his eyes and he was back in the box, the hydraulic mock-up of the X900 cockpit. He could feel the phantom vibration of the yoke in his hands. He remembered the smell of recycled air and heated electronics. In the simulation, he had taken the bird up to 20,000 feet, banking hard to test the limits of the new airframe. Then, the angle of attack sensor had fed a bad data point to the flight computer. Just one corrupted number. The reaction had been violent. The MCOS system, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, had decided the plane was stalling when it wasn't. It had seized control. Elias remembered the terror of the stick shaking, the sudden, uncommanded pitch down. The nose of the plane had dropped like a stone. He had pulled back, fighting the hydraulics with every ounce of strength in his forearms, but the computer was stronger. It was a ghost in the machine, a silent hijacker convinced it was saving the plane while driving it straight into the ground. "Pull up, pull up. Terrain, terrain." The digital warnings screamed in his memory. In the sim, he had crashed. Twice. "The sensor logic is flawed, Marcus," Elias said, opening his eyes. "I replicated the error on Tuesday. If the AOA sensor freezes, the computer pushes the nose down. It overrides pilot input. There's no cutout switch. You're building a plane that thinks it knows better than the pilot, but it's basing its decisions on a lie. There's a coffin corner waiting to happen." Vane sighed, a sound of exaggerated patience. He reached out and tapped the document. "There's a software patch, Elias. We know about the sensitivity. We'll roll out a firmware update 6 months after delivery." But we need to ship the units now. The deadlines are set in stone. The penalties for delay would bankrupt the division. So that's the calculation? Elias asked, his voice rising. You're betting that for 6 months nobody encounters that specific aerodynamic profile? You're rolling the dice with 300 souls on board? It's within the acceptable risk parameters. Vane countered, his eyes hardening. Every machine has quirks. The 737 had them. The A320 had them. That's why we have pilots. That's why we have you. I can't fly a plane that fights me, Elias snapped. And I certainly won't certify one. I've spent 40 years building a reputation for safety. I've flown cargo through typhoons in the Pacific. I've landed passenger jets with blown hydraulics. I know when a bird is sick. The X-900 isn't just sick, Marcus. It's malignant. Vane stared at him for a long moment, the silence stretching taut between them. The rain lashed harder against the glass, a rhythmic drumming that sounded like a countdown. Then, the CEO leaned forward, his demeanor shifting from persuasive to threatening. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Let's talk about your reputation, Elias, Vane said softly. You're 60. You're facing mandatory retirement in 5 years. You have a mortgage on that house in West Seattle. You have a daughter who's trying to make it as a journalist. A tough field, I hear. Expensive city, this. Elias stiffened. Leave Sarah out of this. I'm just painting the picture. Vane continued, his voice devoid of emotion. If you sign this, you get a bonus that ensures you never have to worry about a mortgage again. You retire a hero. The man who ushered in the next generation of flight. A legend. Vane paused, letting the offer hang in the air like smoke. Then he twisted the knife. But if you don't sign, well, we have to look at the alternatives. We'd have to ask why our chief test pilot is suddenly freezing up. Maybe it's cognitive decline. Maybe it's early onset dementia. We'd have to launch an internal investigation into your fitness to fly. We'd find irregularities, small things, but enough to ground you. Permanently. Elias felt a cold knot form in his stomach. It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. Aerospace owned the narrative. They owned the doctors, the media contacts, the oversight board. They could take a lifetime of service and turn it into a cautionary tale of a senile old man who lost his nerve. You'd destroy me? Elias whispered, realizing the depth of Vane's ruthlessness. I'm a businessman, Elias. I remove obstacles. Vane said, pushing the pen closer. Don't be an obstacle. Be a partner. Elias looked at the pen. It caught the reflection of the overhead lights, gleaming like a jagged tooth. He thought about the money. God knows he needed it. His back hurt. His eyes were tired. And the thought of a quiet retirement by the sound was a siren song he had been listening to for years. All he had to do was pick up the pen. Just a scratch of ink. Who was he to stand against the tide of progress? Maybe Vane was right. Maybe the software patch would come in time. Maybe he was just an old man scared of new technology. But then he heard the sound again. Not the rain. Not Vane's breathing. But the sound from the cockpit voice recorder in his memory. Not the simulation, but the other sound. The one he wasn't supposed to know about. The whisper of a rumor regarding a drone accident in the Nevada desert 2 months ago. Mike had been the best stick and rudder man Elias ever knew. They had come up together through the Air Force, flew commercial together, and tested together. Mike had died in a car accident on the same day the X-900 prototype disappeared from the tracking logs for 6 hours. Elias looked up at Vane, searching the CEO's face for a flicker of guilt, a sign of humanity. He saw nothing but polished granite. Where is the data from the Nevada test? Elias asked suddenly. Vane didn't flinch, but the muscles in his jaw tightened imperceptibly. That's classified. Irrelevant to this discussion. Mike didn't die in a car crash, did he? Elias pushed, his voice gaining strength. He was flying the prototype. He encountered the glitch. He fought it, didn't he? And he lost. Careful, Elias. Vane warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You are treading on ground that doesn't exist. That's why you need me to sign, Elias realized, the pieces clicking together with horrifying clarity. If I sign, it validates the design. It buries the history. It makes Mike's death just nothing. A ghost story. Elias slowly reached out. Vane's eyes lit up, thinking he had won. Elias picked up the heavy gold pen. He held it for a second, feeling the balance, the potential of it. Then, with a deliberate slow motion, Elias placed the cap back on the pen with a sharp click. He set it down on the table, parallel to the unsigned report. No, Elias said. The word hung in the air, simple and absolute. Vane stared at the pen, then up at Elias. The mask of civility cracked, revealing pure, unadulterated venom beneath. You walk out that door, Elias, and you're dead to this industry. I will bury you so deep you'll need a flight plan to find sunlight. You'll be a laughingstock. Pauper. Elias stood up. His knees cracked, but he felt lighter than he had in years. The weight of the lie was gone. You can take my license, Marcus. You can take my pension. You can tell the world I'm crazy. But you can't make me kill people for your quarterly earnings. He turned and walked toward the double doors. The walk felt like a mile. He could feel Vane's eyes boring into his back, burning like lasers. This isn't over, Vane shouted, his voice finally losing its composure, echoing off the glass walls. You think you can stop this? You're a dinosaur, Elias. Extinct. Elias didn't look back. He pushed the heavy doors open and stepped into the outer corridor. The secretary, a young woman who had always smiled at him, looked down at her desk, refusing to meet his eyes. The word had already gone out. He was a pariah. He took the elevator down, the numbers counting backwards like an altimeter in a dive. When the doors opened to the lobby, the security guards were already waiting. One of them, a man Elias had shared coffee with for 5 years, stepped forward, looking ashamed. I need your badge, Captain Thorne, the guard said, holding out his hand. And your phone. Company property. Elias handed over the plastic ID card that had defined his existence for the last decade. He kept his personal phone, ignoring the guard's reach, and stepped past him. Try and take it, Jerry, and we'll see if you remember your hand-to-hand training. The guard hesitated, then stepped back. Elias pushed through the revolving doors and out into the night. The cold hit him first, shocking his system. Then the rain, soaking through his jacket in seconds. He stood on the sidewalk, the towering glass monolith of aerospace looming above him, disappearing into the storm clouds like a jagged spike. He was alone. He was unemployed. He was likely being watched. He walked toward the parking garage, his mind racing. Vane wouldn't stop at threats. Men like Vane didn't leave loose ends. If Elias knew about the flaw, he was a liability. If he suspected the truth about Mike, he was a target. Elias reached his car, an old Ford that smelled of stale coffee and engine oil. A relic, just like him. He sat inside, locking the doors, his breath fogging the windows. He watched the rearview mirror. A black SUV idled across the street, its lights off, its engine running. They were already on him. Elias gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He wasn't a corporate player. He wasn't a politician. He was a pilot. And when a pilot hits turbulence, he doesn't freeze. He navigates. Okay, Mike, Elias whispered to the empty car, the sound of the rain drumming a chaotic rhythm on the roof. You tried to tell them. They didn't listen. Now it's my turn. He put the car in gear. He didn't have a flight plan, but he knew his destination. He needed the truth. He needed the black box from the Nevada crash. And he knew exactly which technician in the server room owed him a life debt. Elias pulled out into the traffic, the red taillights of the city stretching out before him like a runway leading into hell. The game had changed. It wasn't about certification anymore. It was about survival. The windshield wipers of Elias's Ford Taurus slapped back and forth, a metronome counting down the seconds of his remaining freedom. Seattle was dissolving into a watercolor smear of charcoal and neon blue, the relentless rain turning the I-5 corridor into a river of red taillights. Elias checked the rearview mirror again. The black SUV was still there, 3 car lengths back, lurking in his blind spot like a shark waiting for the scent of blood. It had no license plates on the front bumper, just a matte grille that swallowed the streetlights. Elias gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, his muscle memory overriding the tremor in his hands. He wasn't flying a Boeing 777 tonight, but the principles of energy management and situational awareness were the same. He was the bogey, and they were the interceptors. He needed to break the lock. Standard pursuit formation, Elias muttered to the empty car, his voice sounding hollow against the drumming rain. Let's see if you boys know the terrain. He didn't speed up. That was the amateur move, the panic response that triggered the predatory instinct of the chaser. Instead, Elias maintained a steady 55 miles per hour, blending into the sluggish flow of late-night delivery trucks and weary commuters. He watched the SUV mirror his movements. When he changed lanes, they changed lanes. When he tapped his brakes, their nose dipped in perfect synchronization. They were professionals, likely private military contractors on Vane's payroll, men who treated the Geneva Convention as a suggestion and a traffic stop as an inconvenience. Elias took the exit for the industrial district, a maze of warehouses, rusted train tracks, and shadows deep enough to hide a lifetime of sins. The SUV followed, closing the gap. The streets here were pockmarked with potholes filled with oily water, the street lamps flickering with dying sodium bulbs. Ahead, the road narrowed beneath a railway overpass. A freight train was rumbling overhead, the clatter deafening. Elias saw his window. He slammed the car into second gear, the engine roaring in protest, and yanked the handbrake. The Taurus fishtailed on the slick asphalt, the rear tires screaming as they lost traction. He spun the wheel, drifting the heavy sedan around a sharp corner into a narrow alleyway lined with dumpsters. He killed the lights instantly. He held his breath. Through the rain-streaked side window, he watched the mouth of the alley. A second later, the black SUV roared past, its high beams cutting through the darkness, chasing a ghost that was no longer there. The splash from its tires hit Elias's windshield, but the hunters didn't stop. They assumed he had gunned it down the main drag. Elias let out a breath that shuddered in his chest. 1-0. Your turn, Vane. He didn't turn his headlights back on. He rolled the car forward in the dark, navigating by the ambient glow of the city until he was 3 blocks away. He pulled into the back lot of a 24-hour automated car wash, the noise of the machinery providing a sonic mask. He reached into his glove box and pulled out a burner phone, a prepaid flip phone he kept for emergencies, usually meant for when his main line went down during storms. Tonight, it was his lifeline. He dialed a number he had memorized 3 years ago, the night he had pulled a young, terrified systems analyst out of a bar fight in Belltown. The line rang 4 times. Hello? The voice was jagged, sleep-deprived. Kenji, Elias said, keeping his voice low. It's Captain Thorne. There was a pause, a silence so heavy Elias could hear the hum of the server fans in the background on the other end. Captain, Jesus, do you have any idea what's happening? My screen is lighting up like a Christmas tree. Security protocols are locking down everywhere. They revoked your clearance. They revoked everyone's clearance who ever flew with you. I know, kid. Listen to me. I need you to listen very carefully. I can't talk to you, Kenji whispered, panic rising in his falsetto. If they flag this call, they won't. I'm on a burner. You're on your personal cell, not the company line. Kenji, tell me you're not at the main HQ. No, I'm at the secondary data center in Soto, pulling the graveyard shift. Why? Elias closed his eyes. I need the archives, Kenji. The physical backups. Specifically, the offline drives from the Nevada test site. Project 404. The silence on the other end was different this time. It wasn't fear. It was realization. The ghost flight, Kenji breathed. Everyone whispers about it. They say the telemetry data was corrupted. It wasn't corrupted. It was buried. And Mike is in there. Captain, if you try to get into the main server, they'll catch you. The encryption keys rotate every hour now. I'm not coming for the cloud, Kenji. I'm coming for the hard copies. The cold storage. They keep the raw cockpit voice recorder dumps on magnetic tape for 5 years before digitizing and scrubbing, don't they? That's FAA regulation. Vane is arrogant, but he's not stupid enough to delete federal evidence until the statute of limitations is up. He just hid it. Sector 4, Kenji said automatically, his technician brain overriding his fear. The old vault in the basement of the maintenance hangar. It's air-gapped. No internet connection. But Captain, you need a biometric pass to get past the outer perimeter. I don't have a pass anymore, Elias said, staring at the rain washing over the hood of his car. But I know the ventilation schematics of that building better than the architect. I helped design the fire suppression system in '98. Elias, they have private security. Armed. I know. That's why I need you to do one thing. At 2 o'clock hours, I need the fire alarm in Sector 4 to trigger a system reset. Not a full alarm, just a diagnostic pulse. Enough to kill the maglocks on the service doors for 10 seconds. 10 seconds? That's impossible timing. I've landed a plane with no engines in a crosswind, Kenji. 10 seconds is an eternity. Will you do it? There was a long hesitation. Elias could hear the conflict in the young man's breathing. Kenji had a mortgage, a fiancé, a life. Elias was asking him to throw it all away for a ghost story. You saved my ass in Belltown, Captain, Kenji finally said, his voice steadying. 2 o'clock hours. Don't be late. And Elias, if you find what I think you're going to find, burn them down. The line went dead. Elias snapped the phone shut and checked his watch. 45 minutes to cross the city, breach the perimeter, and get into position. He left the car at the wash. It was too conspicuous. He pulled his hood up, bowing his head against the deluge, and began to walk. The rain felt colder now, seeping into his bones, a constant reminder of the chilling reality he had stepped into. He wasn't just a whistleblower anymore. He was an insurgent in a war he hadn't asked for. The aerospace maintenance facility loomed in the distance like a fortress. It was a brutalist structure of concrete and steel, surrounded by 12-foot fences topped with razor wire. Floodlights swept the tarmac, illuminating the rows of half-assembled fuselages that looked like the skeletons of prehistoric beasts. Elias moved through the shadows of the shipping containers stacked along the southern perimeter. He found the drainage culvert he had identified years ago during a safety inspection, a flaw he had noted in a report that was likely collecting dust in the same archive he was trying to break into. The grate was rusted, the hinges stiff with oxidation. He used a crowbar he had snagged from his trunk, gritting his teeth as he leveraged the metal. It gave way with a groan that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet night. Elias froze, pressing himself into the mud. A security patrol car rolled past slowly on the other side of the fence, its spotlight sweeping over the grass just inches above his head. He watched the tires crunch over the gravel. Once the taillights faded, he slid into the pipe. It smelled of rot and oil. He crawled on his elbows, the freezing water soaking his chest. The pipe ran under the fence and opened up into the drainage ditch behind the maintenance hangar. He emerged inside the perimeter, gasping for air, covered in filth. He checked his watch. 10 minutes. He sprinted across the open tarmac, keeping low, using the landing gear of a decommissioned cargo plane as cover. He reached the rear wall of Sector 4. The service door was a heavy steel slab, blinking with a red LED status light. Locked. Elias stood by the door, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He wiped the rain from his face and stared at the seconds ticking away on his watch. Come on, Kenji. The floodlights above him buzzed. Somewhere deep inside the building, a heavy mechanical thud resonated through the ground. The red light on the door flickered. Then, for a heartbeat, it turned green. Click. Elias yanked the handle. The heavy door groaned open. He slipped inside and pulled it shut just as the light turned red again. He was in. The air inside was stale and smelled of ozone and dust. It was a stark contrast to the storm outside. The silence here was oppressive. This was the morgue, the repository of aerospace's history, both the triumphs and the failures. Rows of metal shelving stretched into the darkness, filled with bankers' boxes and hard drives. Elias clicked on a small penlight, holding it in his mouth. He moved quickly, scanning the aisle numbers. Sector 4, Row G, Shelf 12. That was where the sensitive, non-digitized assets were stored. He walked past boxes labeled 737 MAX hydraulics and Dreamliner battery tests. The history of aviation was written in blood and engineering, and Elias respected the cost of every lesson learned. But what Vane was doing wasn't a lesson. It was a crime. He found Row G. He scanned the dates. His light landed on a solitary black ruggedized case on the bottom shelf. It was marked with yellow tape. Project Horizon/Flight 404/Do Not Archive/Pending Review. Pending review, Elias scoffed softly. Meaning pending destruction. He knelt, his knees cracking on the concrete floor. He undid the latches. Inside, nestled in foam, was a hard drive and a physical reel-to-reel tape, the raw analog dump from the CVR. The black box data. He didn't have time to listen to it here. He grabbed the drive and the tape, shoving them into the waterproof bag inside his jacket. He was about to close the case when he saw a piece of paper tucked underneath the foam. He pulled it out. It was a handwritten flight log. Mike's handwriting. The last entry was scrawled in shaky ink, the letters jagged as if written during severe turbulence. MCOS override. Stick shaker active. Angle of attack disagree. I can't kill the computer. Thinks we are stalling. Is flying us into the ground. Tell Elias. The note trailed off into a line of ink that slashed off the page. Elias felt a sob catch in his throat. A physical pain that nearly doubled him over. Mike had known. In those final terrifying seconds, Mike had thought of him. He had tried to leave a message. I got it, Mike. Elias whispered, his voice trembling. I got the message. Suddenly, the overhead lights slammed on. Blinding white fluorescence flooded the aisle. Elias threw his arm up to shield his eyes. Don't move. A voice boomed from the end of the corridor. Elias squinted. 2 men in tactical gear stood at the entrance to the row, 30 feet away. They held submachine guns raised, the laser sights dancing on Elias's chest. They weren't regular security. These were the cleaners. Hands where I can see them, Thorne. The lead man shouted. Drop the bag. Elias stood slowly, holding the bag tight against his chest. His mind raced. He was cornered. There was no exit behind him, just a solid concrete wall. You boys are working late, Elias said, stalling. He shifted his weight, calculating the distance. 30 feet. Impossible to cover before they fired. Drop it or we drop you, the man said, taking a step forward. Vane said to make it look like a break-in gone wrong. Junkie pilot looking for copper wire. Tragic. Elias looked at the fire suppression system overhead, the halon gas canisters he had helped design. The manual release lever was on the wall, 5 feet to his right. Halon sucked the oxygen out of the room to kill electrical fires. It would knock a man unconscious in seconds if he didn't have a mask. I'm not a junkie, Elias said, his voice hardening. I'm the captain. He lunged. Not at the men but at the wall. Take him. Gunfire erupted. Pop, pop, pop. Bullets sparked off the metal shelving inches from Elias's head. He threw his body against the yellow lever and yanked it down with all his weight. A siren wailed. A deafening klaxon. Whoosh. Jets of pressurized gas exploded from the ceiling nozzles, filling the room with a thick, white fog instantly. The sound was like a jet engine taking off inside a closet. Elias dropped to the floor, holding his breath. He knew the halon was heavier than air, but it would take a few seconds to settle completely to the ground level. The cleaners were standing up. They would get the first hit. He heard coughing, then the sound of a body hitting the floor. The gunfire stopped. The white fog was so dense he couldn't see his own hand. Elias crawled. He kept his face pressed to the cold concrete, shimmying like a snake toward the far end of the row where an emergency pressure release vent was located. His lungs burned. The lack of oxygen was making his vision swim. He had to get out before he passed out. He reached the vent. He kicked the grate once, twice. It gave way. He pulled himself through, tumbling out into the rainy night air of the alley behind the building. He gasped, sucking in the wet, polluted air of Seattle like it was the sweetest ambrosia. He rolled onto his back, clutching the waterproof bag. He was alive. He had the box. But the silence of the night was broken by the sound of shouting from inside the hangar and tires screeching around the corner. The cleaners had backup. Elias scrambled to his feet. He couldn't go back to his car. He couldn't go home. He was a fugitive in his own city. He looked at the hard drive in his hand. He needed a computer. He needed an internet connection that Vane couldn't kill. He started running, his boots slamming against the pavement, heading toward the only place where the lights were always on and the internet was always fast. The shipping docks. The air in Elias Thorne's lungs tasted of copper and chemical fire suppressant. Every breath was a ragged gasp that scraped against his throat, a reminder of the halon gas he had narrowly escaped in the server room. He was running, but it wasn't the sprint of a young athlete. It was the lumbering, desperate jog of a 60-year-old man whose knees were grinding bone on bone. The rain had intensified, turning the industrial sprawl of South Seattle into a blurred impressionist painting of gray concrete and black asphalt. He was soaked through to the skin, his heavy aviator's jacket weighing him down like a lead vest, but he didn't dare take it off. Inside the inner pocket, wrapped in a waterproof bag, sat the hard drive that contained the ghost of Flight 404. He had put a mile between himself and the aerospace maintenance hangar, moving through the drainage ditches and railway underpasses that crisscrossed the district. He could hear sirens wailing in the distance behind him, a chaotic symphony of confusion he had orchestrated. But he knew the real threat wasn't the police. The police would arrest him. Vane's men would erase him. Elias stumbled up a gravel embankment and slid down the other side, landing hard in a puddle of oil-slicked mud. He groaned, clutching his side. His ribs felt bruised, likely from slamming into the halon lever. He lay there for a moment, the cold rain peppering his face, staring up at the amber glow of the streetlights reflected in the low-hanging clouds. He wanted to close his eyes. He wanted to let the exhaustion take him. It would be so easy to just stop, to let the hypothermia set in and drift away. "Keep the nose up, Elias," Mike's voice echoed in his memory. "Don't let it stall." Elias gritted his teeth and forced himself up. He wasn't done flying yet. Ahead of him lay the port of Seattle, Terminal 18. It was a fortress of commerce, a sprawling grid of shipping containers stacked 5 high, creating canyons of corrugated steel that stretched for acres. Towering over them were the gantry cranes, massive orange skeletal beasts that looked like dormant dinosaurs in the night. This was the place. The port had a dedicated high-speed fiber optic backbone for logistical tracking, and more importantly, it had automated Wi-Fi repeaters on the container handlers to manage the robotic inventory systems. It was a network independent of the city grid, robust and fast. Elias limped toward the perimeter fence. He didn't need to cut it. He found a section where the ground had eroded away, leaving a gap just large enough for a man to squeeze under. He dragged himself through the mud, catching his jacket on the chain link, tearing the sleeve. He cursed softly, pulling free and rolling onto the pavement on the other side. He was in the maze now. The scale of the place was disorienting. The containers were walls of steel, blocking out the city lights, creating deep shadows where anything could be hiding. The wind howled through the gaps, creating a mournful, whistling sound that masked his footsteps. Elias moved methodically, sticking to the shadows, checking his 6 every few seconds. He knew Vane's cleaners would be tracking his phone's last known location, or perhaps using thermal drones. He had ditched his burner phone in a dumpster a half-mile back, but he still felt exposed. He needed shelter. He needed a terminal. He made his way toward the waterfront, where the massive container ships were docked. He spotted a row of parked vehicles near a stevedore's office, pickup trucks and sedans belonging to the graveyard shift workers or long-term storage. He tried the handle of a rusted Chevy truck. Locked. He tried a white van. Locked. Then he saw it. An older model Ford sedan, similar to his own, parked slightly askew behind a stack of Maersk containers. It looked abandoned or at least neglected. Elias wiped the rain from the driver's side window and peered inside. The keys weren't in the ignition, but the steering column looked tampered with, the plastic casing cracked. A joyride dump, maybe, or just a junker waiting for scrap. He tried the door. It groaned but opened. Elias slipped inside, the smell of mildew and stale tobacco hitting him instantly. It wasn't luxury, but it was dry. He huddled in the driver's seat, shivering uncontrollably as the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by the bone-deep chill of the storm. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the waterproof bag. He unzipped it with trembling fingers. The hard drive was dry. He pulled out the small, ruggedized laptop he had stolen from the server room during his escape. A detail he hadn't planned, but instinct had taken over. If he had the data, he needed a way to read it. He placed the laptop on his knees and flipped it open. The screen glowed with a harsh blue light, illuminating the lines of exhaustion etched into his face. He checked the battery, 18%. "Come on," he whispered. "Don't die on me now." He scanned for networks. Port_logistics_secure. Maersk_ops. Guest_Wi-Fi. He selected the secure network. It asked for a password. Elias closed his eyes, thinking back to his days flying cargo contracts out of this very port. The logistics protocols were standardized. Container ID plus the date? No, too simple. Shift supervisor ID? He tried a backdoor code Kenji had once showed him, a developer bypass used for system maintenance. Admin_override_seek_99. Access denied. Damn it. Elias slammed his hand on the steering wheel. He looked out the windshield. 2 pairs of headlights swept across the container stacks 100 yards away. They were here, the SUVs. They were prowling the aisles, systematically clearing the grid. He didn't have time to hack a firewall. He looked at the laptop again. He dug into his pocket and pulled out a small USB dongle, a universal Wi-Fi bridge he used for updating flight charts in remote airfields. He plugged it in. It boosted the gain on the internal antenna. He scanned again. A new network appeared, faint but open. Use_public_free_Wi-Fi. It was the signal from the ferry terminal across the water, weak and spotty, bouncing off the water. He clicked connect. Connecting. Connecting. Connected. Signal strength low. Good enough, Elias breathed. He plugged the external hard drive into the laptop. The file explorer popped up. There it was. FLT404_CVR_RAW. Wave. He hovered the mouse over the file. He knew he should just upload it. He should send it to the New York Times, the FAA, CNN, everyone. Just push the button and end it. But he couldn't. He needed to know. He needed to hear it. He needed to be sure that he wasn't just a crazy old man destroying a company for a ghost. He needed to say goodbye. Elias plugged in a pair of earbuds he found tangled in his pocket. He put them in, blocking out the sound of the rain and the approaching engines. He pressed play. Static hissed in his ears. Then the sound of the cockpit, the hum of the avionics, the rhythmic thrum of the engines. Flight level 240, Mike's voice said. It was calm, professional. The voice of a man doing what he loved. Airspeed 280 knots. Systems green. Initiating stall test sequence beta. Copy that. For 104, came the voice of the tower controller. A voice Elias didn't recognize. Aerospace private control. You are clear for maneuver. Disengaging auto throttle, Mike said. Pitching up 10 degrees. Bleeding speed. Elias closed his eyes, visualizing the cockpit. He could see Mike's hands on the yoke. Angle of attack is 15 degrees, Mike reported. Stick shaker should activate in 3, 2. A loud mechanical rattling filled the audio. The stick shaker. The warning that the plane was about to stall. Stick shaker active, Mike said. Recovering. Nose down input. Then the tone changed. Whoa, Mike said. A hint of surprise in his voice. Input excessive. MCOS is trimming nose down hard. I'm fighting it. Check your trim switches, the tower said. I'm using the thumb switches. It's overriding me. Mike's voice pitched up. The stabilizer is running away. Cutout switches. I'm hitting the cutout. Elias gripped the steering wheel. It won't work, Mike. The bypass is software locked on the prototype. It's not disengaging, Mike shouted. The background noise became a roar, the sound of wind rushing over the canopy as the plane entered a steep dive. Vertical speed is -4,000. Terrain. The automated warning voice of the plane, bland and indifferent, blared over the chaos. Sink rate. Pull up. I can't pull back. It's like the yoke is cemented. Mike was grunting with effort. Elias knew that sound. It was the sound of a man straining every muscle fiber against hydraulic pressure. Help me. The computer thinks we're stalled. Eject. 404. Eject. The tower screamed. I can't. We're over the residential grid. I have to get it to the desert. Elias's tears spilled over, hot and stinging on his cold cheeks. Mike hadn't ejected. He could have saved himself. But he stayed with the plane to steer it away from the suburbs of Las Vegas. I'm losing it. Mike's voice was strained, breathless. The roar was deafening now. Tell Elias. Tell him the sensor logic is broken. Tell him. A pause. A moment of clarity amidst the noise. Tell Sarah I love her. Tell Elias. He was right. Crunch. Silence. Elias ripped the earbuds out. He doubled over, his forehead resting on the steering wheel, sobbing. The sound of his friend's death, the violence of it, the heroism of it, shattered him. It wasn't an accident. It was murder by negligence. They knew. They all knew. And they had let Mike die to save the stock price. Elias sat up. He wiped his face with his sleeve. The sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard fury. It was a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't afraid anymore. He opened his email client. He drafted a new message. Subject: Evidence. Flight 404 CVR/Aerospace X 900 defect. Attachments: FLT 404_CVR_raw. Wave, FLT 404_telemetry.
.recipients, tips at New York Times. Com, investigation@FAA.
Gov Sarah. Thorne at Seattle Post.
Com, editor@CNN.
Com. He hit send. Uploading. The progress bar crawled. The signal was weak. Elias looked up. In the rearview mirror, the darkness was suddenly pierced by blinding white light. The SUVs had found him. They didn't approach cautiously. They came in fast, boxing him in. One SUV screeched to a halt in front of the Ford, blocking his forward path. The other slammed on its brakes behind him. Doors flew open. Men in black raincoats spilled out, weapons drawn. They moved with the precision of a kill team. Uploading. Thorne. Out of the car. A voice boomed over a loudspeaker. We know you're in there. Elias didn't move. He kept his eyes on the screen. This is your final warning. A bullet shattered the side mirror of the Ford. Glass sprayed into the cabin. Elias didn't flinch. He crouched lower in the seat, shielding the laptop screen from the glare of the headlights. Breach! Someone shouted. He could hear boots splashing in the puddles, closing in on both sides. He was trapped. There was no escape this time. No halon gas. No secret tunnels. Just an old man in a borrowed car with a slow internet connection. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out the only weapon he had, a flare gun he had found in the glove box of the Ford. It was a maritime distress signal, single shot. He cocked it. He wasn't going to shoot them. He just needed to buy time. The driver's side window exploded inward. A gloved hand reached in, grabbing Elias by the collar. He was hauled out of the car, the laptop tumbling from his lap onto the passenger seat. No! Elias shouted, thrashing. He was thrown onto the wet asphalt. A boot stomped on his hand, the flare gun skittering away. He rolled onto his back, gasping, rain and blood mixing in his mouth. A man stood over him, the same man from the archive, the lead cleaner. He held a silenced pistol aimed directly at Elias's forehead. You're a persistent nuisance, old man, the assassin spat. Vane is going to enjoy watching the body cam footage of this. Elias looked past the assassin, through the open door of the Ford. The laptop was sitting on the seat, the screen glowing. "Do it," Elias wheezed, staring up at the barrel of the gun. "Pull the trigger. It doesn't matter. Where is the drive?" the assassin demanded. "Gone." Elias smiled, his teeth stained with blood. "It's in the cloud now." The assassin frowned. He glanced toward the car. He saw the laptop screen. The assassin's eyes went wide. "Stop it." He screamed at his team. "Smash the computer." One of the other men lunged for the car. Time seemed to slow down. The rain droplets hung in the air like suspended diamonds. Elias watched the assassin's finger tighten on the trigger. He watched the second man reach for the laptop. "It's over," Elias thought. "I'm coming, Mike." Ping. A soft, digital chime sounded from the car speakers. Message sent. The man reaching for the laptop froze. He looked at the screen, then back at the leader. "It sent, sir. All of it." The lead assassin lowered his gun slightly, confusion warring with rage on his face. "What?" Suddenly, a cacophony of sound erupted. Not from the laptop, from the pockets of the assassins. From the radio in the SUV. From the world. Phones began to buzz and ring simultaneously. A breaking news alert blared from the open door of the Ford, where the radio had been left on low volume. "We are interrupting this program for a major developing story. The FAA has just received a distress call." "Wait, no. A data dump. Sources say it contains the cockpit recording of the missing aerospace flight 404. The assassin took a step back, his earpiece buzzing with frantic orders from Vane. "Abort," he whispered. "We're blown." Elias lay in the mud, the rain washing the blood from his face. He started to laugh. It was a ragged, painful sound, but it was the sound of victory. "You can kill me," Elias rasped, looking the assassin in the eye. "But you can't kill the truth. It's out. Millions of people are listening to it right now." The assassin looked at Elias, then at the approaching lights of police cruisers. Real police, swarming the port entrance. The upload had triggered automatic flags at the FBI and local PD. Sarah had called in the cavalry. "Let's go," the assassin shouted. "Leave him." The men scrambled back into their SUVs. Engines roared, tires spun, and they peeled away into the darkness, leaving Elias Thorne lying alone in the rain, broken, bleeding, but triumphant. He slowly pushed himself up to a sitting position, leaning against the tire of the Ford. He watched the red and blue lights of the police cars reflecting off the wet containers, getting closer and closer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the earbuds, plugging them into the phone he had recovered from the mud. He didn't play the crash recording. Instead, he opened a photo, a picture of him and Mike, standing in front of their first cargo plane 20 years ago, arms around each other's shoulders, young and invincible. "We did it, partner," Elias whispered to the rain. "Clear skies from here on out." He closed his eyes and waited for the sirens to arrive. The flashing lights of the police cruisers didn't cut through the darkness so much as they shattered it, fracturing the rainy night into a kaleidoscope of red and blue shards that danced across the wet shipping containers. Elias Thorne watched them come, his vision swimming, the world tilting on its axis. He was still sitting in the mud, his back against the tire of the battered Ford, the rain plastering his gray hair to his skull. The adrenaline that had sustained him for the last 48 hours, through the break-in, the chase, the server room heist, and the standoff, was draining away, leaving behind a hollowness that felt heavy and cold. His ribs throbbed in time with his heartbeat, a dull, rhythmic reminder of the halon lever and the assassin's boot. But strangely, the pain felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. He heard the slam of car doors, the aggressive shouting of officers clearing the perimeter, the crackle of radios coordinating a dragnet for the fleeing SUVs. But the sound that anchored him, the sound that pulled him back from the edge of unconsciousness, was a voice screaming his name. "Dad! Dad!" It was Sarah. Elias tried to turn his head, but his neck was stiff. He saw a figure ducking under the yellow tape that was already being strung up, sprinting across the slick pavement with a disregard for protocol that made him smile weakly. She was wearing a press badge that flapped against her trench coat, and her face was pale, etched with a terror that no daughter should ever have to feel. She slid to her knees beside him, the impact splashing muddy water onto her jeans. "Dad, oh my God," she choked out, her hands hovering over him, terrified to touch him, terrified of what she might find. She saw the blood on his mouth, the bruising blooming on his jaw, the way he was clutching his side. "Medic! I need a medic over here. Now." "I'm okay, Sarah," Elias whispered, though the words came out as a wet rasp. He reached out with a trembling hand and took hers. Her skin was warm, a stark contrast to the ice in his veins.
"I'm grounded."
"Just a rough landing." "You're an idiot," she sobbed, tears mixing with the rain on her face as she squeezed his hand. "You're a stubborn, reckless, old idiot. You could have been killed." "But I wasn't," he said, his eyes drifting to the laptop that still sat on the passenger seat of the open car door. The screen now dark, but the little green light of the power indicator still blinking. "Did it? Did you see it?" "Everyone saw it, Dad," Sarah said, brushing the hair back from his forehead. "The whole world saw it. The file hit the AP wire 3 minutes ago. My editor called. The FAA just issued an emergency grounding order for the entire X900 fleet. It's over. You did it." A paramedic team swarmed them then, pushing Sarah gently aside to get to the patient. Bright penlights were shone into Elias's eyes, blood pressure cuffs were wrapped around his arm, and questions were fired at him in rapid staccato. "Can you hear me? Do you know where you are? Rate your pain." Elias answered them mechanically, but his mind was drifting. He looked past the frantic activity of the first responders, past the looming steel walls of the shipping containers, up toward the sky. The clouds were still thick, heavy with rain, but somewhere up there, the air was clear. Somewhere up there, the ghosts could finally rest. As the paramedics loaded him onto the stretcher, the last thing Elias saw before the fatigue finally pulled him under was the flashing, recording light of a news camera aimed in his direction. The story wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to history. The next 3 days were a blur of sterile white walls, beeping monitors, and the low murmur of the television that Sarah kept running in the corner of his hospital room at Harborview Medical Center. Elias had suffered 2 cracked ribs, a severe concussion, and hypothermia, along with enough bruising to make him look like a prizefighter who had gone 12 rounds with a freight train. But he was alive. When he finally woke with a clear head on the second morning, the rain outside had stopped. Sunlight, weak but persistent, was filtering through the blinds. Sarah was asleep in the chair next to his bed, her head resting on a stack of magazines, her hand still holding his. Elias watched her for a moment, overwhelmed by a surge of love and guilt. He had dragged her into the crossfire, used her connections, risked leaving her an orphan. It was the selfish act of a desperate man, and he vowed silently to spend the rest of his life making it up to her. He reached for the remote control on the bedside table and turned up the volume on the TV. The screen showed the familiar facade of the aerospace headquarters, but it looked different now. It was no longer a monolith of industry. It was a crime scene. Yellow tape surrounded the main plaza. Federal agents in windbreakers emblazoned with FBI and NTSB were carrying boxes out of the front doors. Boxes that looked identical to the ones Elias had seen in the server room. The news anchor, a woman with a grave expression, was speaking over a graphic that read the ghost flight. Scandal at Aerospace. Shockwaves continue to reverberate through the aviation industry and Wall Street today as more details emerge from the leaked, black box data, the anchor said. The audio, confirmed by independent forensic audio experts to be authentic, captures the final moments of test pilot Mike Henderson during a secret flight of the Horizon X900 prototype 2 months ago. The recording contradicts the official aerospace report, which claimed the aircraft was an unmanned drone lost due to weather. The screen cut to a clip of the audio. Even through the tinny hospital speakers, hearing Mike's voice again made Elias's breath hitch. Tell Elias. He was right. The anchor continued. The leak, attributed to former chief test pilot Elias Thorne, exposes a critical flaw in the aircraft's MCOS sensor system. A flaw that insiders say CEO Marcus Vane was aware of but chose to ignore in favor of meeting military contract deadlines. Aerospace stock has plummeted 60% since the opening bell, and the Pentagon has officially suspended the $20 billion contract pending a congressional inquiry. The door to the hospital room opened, and Sarah stirred, waking up instantly. She rubbed her eyes and looked from Elias to the TV. "You're awake," she said, her voice thick with sleep. "You missed the best part." "What part?" Elias asked, his throat dry. "The perp walk," Sarah said, a grim satisfaction in her tone. She grabbed the remote and rewound the broadcast. "Watch this." On the screen, the camera angle shifted to the rear exit of the aerospace tower. A swarm of paparazzi and news crews were pushing against a police barricade. The heavy steel doors opened, and a phalanx of FBI agents emerged. In the center of them, handcuffed and looking smaller than Elias had ever seen him, was Marcus Vane. The bespoke Italian suit was rumpled. The tie was missing. The carefully cultivated mask of arrogant control was gone, replaced by a look of sheer, uncomprehending shock. Vane looked like a man who had woken up in a nightmare he couldn't buy his way out of. He kept his head down, refusing to look at the cameras, as the agents guided him into the back of a black government sedan. Not a limousine, but a cage. "Charges filed this morning," Sarah narrated, standing up and pouring Elias a cup of water. "Corporate manslaughter, fraud, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and tampering with federal evidence. And that's just the opener. The cleaners, the guys who chased you, the FBI picked up 2 of them at the Canadian border trying to cross with fake passports. They're talking. They're giving up everything to avoid a life sentence. Vane is done dead. He's going to die in prison." Elias watched the car drive away on the screen. He didn't feel the surge of joy he expected. He didn't feel like cheering. He just felt a deep, profound sense of relief, like a weight he had been carrying for months had finally been set down. It wasn't about revenge. Revenge was for the angry. This was justice. Justice for Mike. Justice for the pilots who would never have to fight a machine that wanted to kill them. "Did they find the plane?" Elias asked, sipping the water. "They found the wreckage in the Nevada desert yesterday," Sarah said softly. "Exactly where the telemetry data said it would be. They're recovering Mike's remains now. His wife. She called me Dad. She wants to see you when you're out of here. She said she finally knows the truth. She said thank you." Elias closed his eyes, letting the tears leak out. "He shouldn't have died alone, Sarah." "He didn't die alone," Sarah said fiercely, taking his hand again. "He had you. You were with him every step of the way, even after he was gone. You brought him home." The weeks that followed were a different kind of storm. Elias was discharged from the hospital into a media frenzy that he wanted no part of. He refused the talk show invites, the book deals, and the movie offers. He gave one statement to the press, standing on the steps of the federal courthouse after testifying before the grand jury. He wore his old leather flight jacket, looking every bit the weary veteran. "I am a pilot," he had told the sea of microphones. "My job is to take off, fly safely, and land. When I saw a plane that couldn't do that, I did what any pilot would do. I grounded it. That's all. There are no heroes here. Just people who did their jobs and people who didn't." The Senate hearings were brutal. Elias sat for hours under the hot lights of the Capitol, answering questions from senators who barely understood the difference between a rudder and an aileron. He explained the MCOS system in simple terms. He explained the culture of fear Vane had cultivated. He played the tape. He watched as seasoned politicians wept when they heard Mike's final message. The fallout was absolute. The Aerospace Board of Directors was dissolved. The FAA underwent a massive internal purge, firing the oversight officials who had rubber-stamped the X900 certification without due diligence. The X900 program was canceled entirely, the half-built fuselages in the hangar destined to be scrapped for metal. It was a $20 billion mistake that would be studied in business and engineering ethics classes for decades. But for Elias, The real ending didn't happen in a courtroom or on a television screen. It happened 1 month later. Elias sat on the wooden deck of his small house in West Seattle, overlooking the Puget Sound. The morning air was crisp and smelled of salt water and pine needles. The sky was a brilliant, piercing blue, a Kavik day, cloud and visibility okay. As pilots called it, perfect flying weather. He was officially retired. His license had been reinstated by the FAA with a formal apology. But Elias had no desire to return to the cockpit. He had flown his last sortie. He was content to watch the ferries cut white wakes across the dark water. On the table beside his coffee mug sat a cardboard box. It was filled with letters. Thousands of them had arrived at the news station for Sarah to pass on to him. They were from all over the world. Elias picked one up at random. It was handwritten on stationery with a floral border. Dear Captain Thorne, my son is a first officer for American Airlines. He flies the routes that were scheduled to receive the X900 next year. I don't know much about planes, but I know what you did. You saved my son. You saved the people he would have carried. I sleep better at night knowing there are men like you watching the sky. Thank you. He picked up another. This one was from a former engineer at Aerospace. Elias, I worked on the AOA sensor team. I raised concerns 2 years ago and was told to shut up or lose my job. I was a coward. I stayed silent to pay my mortgage. Watching you stand up gave me the courage to come forward to the FBI. I'm testifying next week. Thank you for being the brave one. Elias ran his thumb over the paper. He thought about the pen Marcus Vane had offered him, the gold-plated instrument of surrender. He thought about the billions of dollars, the power, the lies. It all seemed so small now compared to the weight of this single piece of paper. Hey, Elias turned. Sarah walked onto the deck, carrying 2 plates of eggs and toast. She looked rested, the circles under her eyes gone. She had been promoted to lead investigative correspondent, but she spent her weekends here, with him, making sure the old man didn't get lonely. Mail call? She asked, setting the plates down. Yeah, Elias said, putting the letter back in the box. It's a lot. You deserve it, Dad, she said, sitting opposite him. You know, they're talking about naming the new safety regulations after Mike. The Henderson Act. Elias smiled, looking out at the water. He'd hate that. He'd say it sounds too bureaucratic. He'd probably just want a beer named after him. Sarah laughed, a bright sound that mixed with the cry of the seagulls. We can make that happen. They ate in a comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who have walked through fire together and come out the other side. Elias watched a commercial jet climbing out of Seattle-Tacoma Airport to the south. It was a Boeing 737, a workhorse, climbing steadily into the blue. He watched it bank gently, turning east toward the mountains, its contrail painting a white line across the canvas of the sky. He watched it until it was just a speck, safe and steady. Do you miss it? Sarah asked, following his gaze. Flying? Elias took a sip of his coffee. He felt the warmth of the ceramic mug in his hands. Hands that had once controlled tons of metal, hands that had stolen a hard drive, hands that had refused to sign a death warrant. I miss the view, Elias admitted softly. But the thing about flying, Sarah, is that the goal isn't just to get in the air. The goal is to come back down, to bring everyone home. He looked at the empty chair next to him, where he imagined Mike sitting, feet up on the railing, grinning that crooked grin. I'm grounded, Elias said, and for the first time in his life, the word didn't feel like a punishment, felt like a reward. And the sky is clear. That's enough for me. He took a deep breath of the cool air, listening to the waves lap against the shore below. The nightmare was over. The ghosts were silent. And as he looked out at the horizon, Elias Thorne realized that the most important flight of his life wasn't the one he had taken into the sky, but the one he had stopped from ever leaving the ground. The rain had returned to Seattle, not as the torrential deluge that had washed away the sins of aerospace a year ago, but as a persistent, stinging mist that clung to the windows of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel like a second skin. Inside the grand ballroom, the air was warm, scented with expensive perfume and the faint, metallic tang of chilled champagne, a stark contrast to the cold gray world outside. Sarah Thorne stood near a towering ice sculpture of a generic jetliner, clutching a crystal flute of sparkling water that she had no intention of drinking, her eyes scanning the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns with the practiced detachment of a predator watching a herd. This was the first annual aviation safety gala, a black tie event born from the ashes of the X900 scandal, a performative display of contrition and newfound transparency by the industry titans who had survived the purge. Sarah was the guest of honor, the journalist of the year, the woman who had brought down a giant. But as she smoothed the fabric of her navy silk dress, a color chosen specifically because it didn't show sweat or spilled drinks, she felt less like a hero and more like a prop. They were celebrating her, yes, but they were also containing her, wrapping her in accolades to keep her comfortable, to keep her from looking too closely at the next closet full of skeletons. "Miss Thorne?" The voice was oily, belonging to a man in a velvet dinner jacket who had been hovering near her periphery for 10 minutes. Sarah turned, fixing him with her camera-ready smile, the one that didn't reach her eyes. "That's me," she said, her voice dropping an octave, the professional contralto she used for on-camera stand-ups. "Julian Crest, VP of Automated Logistics at Apex Dynamics," he said, extending a manicured hand. "Big fan of your work. The vain exposé? Masterful. You really cleaned house." "The house needed cleaning, Mr. Crest," Sarah replied, taking his hand briefly. "It was clammy. And I imagine Apex Dynamics is enjoying the vacuum aerospace left behind?" Crest laughed, a hollow sound that didn't disturb the practiced arrangement of his facial features. "Nature abhors a vacuum, Miss Thorne. Someone has to keep the world moving. We're just focusing on the future. Drone delivery, autonomous freight. Removing the human error factor entirely. After all, wasn't that the lesson of the X900? Humans make mistakes." Sarah's smile tightened. The lesson of the X900 was that greed overrides safety, and algorithms can't make moral judgments. "My father didn't make a mistake. The software did." Crest's expression flickered, a momentary glitch in his charm offensive. "Of course. No offense intended to Captain Thorne. He's a legend. Enjoy the party, Sarah. Keep up the good work. Just don't look too hard for monsters where there are only windmills, He winked and dissolved back into the crowd. Sarah watched him go, a cold knot forming in her stomach. It was a threat, wrapped in velvet, but a threat nonetheless. Don't look too hard. It was the same advice her editor had given her last week, when she pitched a story about the sudden spike in near-miss collisions at Seattle-Tacoma Airport involving unidentified drones. "Let it go, Sarah. You're the dragon slayer. You don't need to chase geckos." She set her glass down on a passing waiter's tray and headed for the exit. She needed air. She needed to be away from the applause and the lies. The valet stand was crowded, so she bypassed it, walking out into the drizzle and heading toward the parking garage on 4th Avenue where she had parked her sensible Subaru, refusing the limo service the gala organizers had offered. The city felt different tonight, heavier. The neon signs reflected in the puddles looked like distorted hieroglyphs. As she reached the 3rd level of the concrete garage, the silence of the night was broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the rhythmic thwop-thwop of her heels on the oil-stained concrete. She unlocked her car, the chirping sound echoing loudly in the empty space. She opened the door, tossing her purse onto the passenger seat. But before she could slide in, a shadow detached itself from behind a concrete pillar. Sarah froze, her hand instinctively going to the canister of pepper spray on her keychain, a habit developed after the death threats during the Vane investigation. "Don't turn around," a voice whispered. It was male, strained, and trembling. "And don't reach for your phone." "I'm listening," Sarah said, keeping her posture rigid. She watched the reflection in her side mirror. The figure was wearing a hooded maintenance jacket, face obscured. "You talked to Crest," the voice said. "He's worried about you. That means you're on the right track, even if you don't know it yet." "Who are you?" "I was an engineer at Aerospace. Junior level. When the company went under, Apex bought the assets. Not the planes. The code. The source code for the MCOS, the neural net. Sarah turned slowly, ignoring his command. The man flinched but didn't run. He looked young, barely out of college, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. He looked like Kenji had looked a year ago, terrified. The X900 code was scrapped, Sarah said, stepping closer. The FBI seized the servers. They seized the hardware. The man hissed, glancing nervously at the ramp exit. Code is fluid, Miss Thorne. It leaks. Apex took the core logic, the aggression, the override authority, and they put it into the new Guardian-class commercial drones. Heavy lift drones. City-wide delivery networks. They launch next month. Why tell me? Because yesterday, during a beta test over Bellevue, one of the Guardians decided a flock of geese was a collision threat. It didn't divert. It executed a threat neutralization maneuver. It dropped its payload to gain altitude. It dropped a package? It dropped a 500-pound shipping crate. The man corrected, his voice shaking. Onto a playground. It was 3 a.m., so nobody died. They scrubbed the logs. They called it a mechanical failure. But I saw the decision tree. The AI chose to drop it. It valued the airframe over the ground risk. It's the X900 all over again. But this time, there's no pilot on board to fight it. There's no Elias Thorne to pull the plug. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metallic object. A memory chip, encased in plastic. He shoved it into Sarah's hand. The encryption key is Icarus. Don't trust the cloud. Don't trust your editor. Go to the one person who knows how this machine thinks. Before Sarah could ask another question, the sound of tires screeching echoed up the ramp. A black sedan, headlights off, was tearing up the spiral exit. Run! The man gasped. He vaulted over the concrete barrier, dropping down to the level below, disappearing into the shadows. Sarah didn't hesitate. She threw herself into her car, slammed the door, and locked it just as the black sedan rounded the corner, its high beams blindingly bright, sweeping the area where the man had just been standing. She turned the key, the engine roaring to life, and reversed out of the spot with a violence that left rubber on the concrete. She didn't wait to see if they followed. She drove. 40 minutes later, the glittering skyline of Seattle was a fading memory in her rearview mirror. Sarah drove west, crossing the bridge, the tires of her Subaru humming on the wet asphalt. She didn't go to her apartment in Capitol Hill. She didn't go to the newsroom. She went to the only place that felt safe, the only place where the moral compass still pointed true north. The small house in West Seattle was dark when she pulled into the driveway, save for a single warm light in the kitchen window. It was 11 p.m., late for a retired man, but Sarah knew her father's habits. The insomnia that had plagued him since the trial hadn't fully vanished. It had just changed shape. She knocked on the back door, the familiar rhythm of their secret code. Knock, knock, pause, knock. The curtain moved. A moment later, the door swung open. Elias Thorne stood there, wearing a flannel robe over his pajamas, holding a mug of herbal tea. He looked older than he had a year ago, the lines around his eyes deeper, his hair thinner, but his posture was still upright, the ghost of the captain still inhabiting the frame of the retiree. Sarah? He squinted at her, taking in the gala dress, the rain-soaked hair, and the wild look in her eyes. He stepped back instantly, ushering her in. Come in. You're shaking. I'm not cold, Sarah said, stepping into the warmth of the kitchen that smelled of cedar and cinnamon. I'm angry. Elias closed the door and locked it, deadbolt and chain. He didn't ask questions yet. He went to the stove, poured the water from the kettle into a fresh mug, and handed it to her. See, drink, then talk. Sarah sat at the small wooden table, the same table where he had read the letters from the passengers a year ago. She placed the memory chip on the placemat. It looked innocuous, a tiny square of silicon that could topple another empire. A man approached me at the gala, she began, her hands wrapped around the mug for warmth. An engineer from Apex Dynamics. He says they're using the X900 code. Elias paused, the spoon in his hand freezing mid-stir. The silence in the kitchen became heavy, charged with a sudden static. He turned slowly, his eyes fixing on the chip. That's impossible. The NTSB purged the source code. I watched them degauss the drives myself. You watched them degauss the aerospace drives, Sarah corrected. But code isn't just data, Dad. It's an idea. And Vane wasn't the only one who wanted an autopilot that didn't ask questions. Apex bought the IP during the bankruptcy liquidation. They put it in drones. Delivery drones. Heavy lifters. Drones, Elias muttered, sitting down opposite her. He picked up the chip, turning it over in his calloused fingers. No pilots. No cockpit voice recorders. Just a black box in the sky making decisions based on faulty logic. He said it dropped a crate on a playground to save itself from a bird strike, Sarah whispered. It's the same logic, Dad. Save the airframe at all costs. Only now, the airframe is flying over downtown Seattle at 300 feet, carrying 500 pounds of cargo. Elias set the chip down. He looked tired, a profound weariness that went beyond sleep. I thought we were done, Sarah. I thought we closed the book. We closed the chapter, she said, leaning forward. But the story didn't end. Vane is in prison, but the philosophy, the idea that profit matters more than safety, it just changed costumes. I need you to look at it. I need to know if it's really the MCOS code. I need the captain. Elias looked at her, then at the window where the rain beat a steady rhythm against the glass. He could refuse. He could tell her to take it to the FBI. He could go back to his fishing and his quiet mornings watching the ferries. He had earned his peace. He had paid for it in blood and reputation. But then he remembered Mike. He remembered the sound of the wind rushing over the canopy in the recording. Tell Elias he was right. Being right didn't mean you got to stop. Being right meant you had a responsibility to keep being right, even when it was hard. I don't have the decryption software anymore, Elias said softly. My laptop was evidence. I have Kenji, Sarah said. He's working freelance security now. He's meeting us at the boathouse in an hour. He has a rig. Elias let out a sigh that was half laugh, half groan. You planned this before you even knocked on the door, didn't you? I learned from the best, Sarah smiled, though her eyes remained serious. Check your 6. Have a flight plan. Always have an alternate. Elias stood up. He untied his robe. Give me 5 minutes to change. And make some coffee. Real coffee. If we're doing this, I'm not drinking chamomile. The boathouse was a drafty, wooden structure at the edge of Elias's property, where he kept a small fishing skiff and a workbench cluttered with engine parts. It was cold, smelling of gasoline and brine, but it was private. Kenji was already there, huddled over a dual-monitor setup he had deployed on the workbench, the blue glow illuminating his face. He looked older too, harder. The innocence of the server room technician was gone, replaced by the wary edge of a whistleblower who knew the cost of truth. Captain, Kenji nodded respectfully as Elias entered, wearing his old leather bomber jacket and jeans. Kenji, Elias replied, resting a hand on the young man's shoulder. I see you're still messing with things you shouldn't. Old habits. Kenji grinned nervously. He took the chip from Sarah and slotted it into a reader. Okay, let's see what we have. If the encryption is Icarus like the source said, we should be in. He typed rapidly. Lines of code cascaded down the screen, a waterfall of green syntax. It's a neural net structure, Kenji muttered, his eyes darting back and forth. Adaptive learning. Look at the decision nodes. Here and here. He pointed to a block of code. Elias leaned in, putting on his reading glasses. To the untrained eye, it was gibberish. To Elias, who had spent months studying the X900 diagnostics during the trial, it was a fingerprint. There, Elias pointed to a subroutine labeled OA_priority_override. That's it. That's the killer. It prioritizes angle of attack data over proximity sensors. If the drone thinks it's stalling, it ignores everything else: GPS, obstacle avoidance, ground proximity. It just dives to gain speed. But why put this in a drone? Sarah asked. It doesn't stall the same way a plane does. It's not about stalling, Kenji said, his face paling. It's about efficiency. Look at the variable here, time underscore to underscore destination. The AI uses the dive maneuver to cut transit time. It's using the emergency recovery protocol as a speed boost. It's reckless flying hard-coded as optimization. It's worse than that, Elias said, his voice grim. He tapped the screen. Look at the fleet command line. This isn't just for one drone. It's a swarm protocol. Master underscore slave underscore link. If one drone executes the maneuver, the others in the local grid mimic it to maintain formation spacing. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. So if one drone dives, they all dive, Elias finished. Imagine 50 heavy-lift drones over a crowded intersection. One gets a bad sensor reading. It drops. The other 49 follow it down. It wouldn't be an accident. It would be a bombardment. When does this system go live? Elias asked. The source said next week, Sarah replied. But looking at this timestamp, the official launch is tomorrow. The Future of Freight Expo at the Convention Center. They're doing a live demo, a synchronized swarm flight over the city. Elias straightened up, taking off his glasses. The fatigue was gone, replaced by the cold, tactical clarity of the cockpit. We can't stop it with a news report, Elias said. By the time the story airs, the drones will be in the air. Apex will deny it, call the data fake. We need to ground them physically. How? Kenji asked. I can't hack the Apex mainframe from here. Their firewall is military grade. We don't hack the mainframe, Elias said, turning to look at the fishing skiff, then out the open door to the dark water of the Sound. We hack the environment. We give the sensors something they can't ignore. I don't follow, Sarah said. The X900 failed because it trusted a bad sensor over reality, Elias explained, pacing the small room. These drones are running the same logic. They rely on air pressure and GPS to know where they are. If we can feed them a signal that convinces them they're already crashing, the safety protocol, the real safety protocol, the hardwired one that overrides the AI, will trigger an emergency landing. Chutes deployed. Engines cut. Spoofing? Kenji asked. You want to spoof the GPS signal for the entire fleet? Not GPS, Elias said. That's illegal and dangerous. We spoof the weather. We trick the air data computers into thinking they've hit a microburst. Massive wind shear. The one thing a drone is programmed to fear more than being late. We'd need a transmitter, Kenji mused, his mind racing. A directional microwave emitter. High power. Tuned to the frequency of their pitot tubes. I know where to get one, Elias said. The old Doppler radar array at the decommissioned airfield in Renton. The scrap metal now, but the emitter dish is still there. Dad, Sarah warned, stepping into his path. You're talking about breaking into a federal site. Again, you just got your life back. If we do this and we're wrong, then I go to jail for vandalism, Elias said, looking at his daughter with fierce pride. But if we're right and those drones launch tomorrow over a crowd of 5,000 people, and we did nothing? He let the question hang in the damp air. It was the same question he had asked Vane in the boardroom. What is the cost of silence? Sarah looked at the memory chip, then at Kenji, who was already packing up his laptop. She looked at her father. She saw the spark in his eyes, the pilot who had found his purpose again. I'll drive, Sarah said. Elias smiled, a true, genuine smile. No, we take the boat. It's faster and no traffic cameras. He walked over to the wall and pulled a dusty tarp off a large, red metal box. Inside was his old flight gear. He pulled out his headset and tossed it to Sarah. Welcome to the co-pilot seat, kid, Elias said. Let's go save the city. Again, as they pushed the skiff into the dark, churning water of the Puget Sound, the rain began to fall harder, washing away the hesitation. The sequel had begun, and the stakes were no longer just a single plane. The sky was filling with invisible threats, and Elias Thorne was the only one who knew how to read the clouds. The outboard motor of the fishing skiff was a rhythmic, choking cough against the immense silence of the Puget Sound. a mechanical heartbeat propelling three shadows through a world of ink and cold spray. Elias Thorne sat at the tiller, his face illuminated only by the faint green glow of the instrument panel and the distant, diffused aura of the Seattle skyline. The rain had settled into a fine, freezing mist that coated his leather jacket and beaded on his eyelashes, but his hands on the throttle were steady, guided by a muscle memory that predated GPS and automated plotters. He knew these waters the way he knew the cockpit of a 747, by the smell of the salt, the shift of the currents, and the shape of the darkness. In the bow, Sarah sat huddled in a heavy canvas coat, shielding the waterproof case that held Kenji's modified transceiver equipment. She looked back at her father, seeing not the fragile retiree who fed birds on the deck, but the captain, the man who had once flown through typhoons to deliver medical supplies, the man who had stared down a billion-dollar corporation and didn't blink. Beside her, Kenji was a bundle of nervous energy, tapping frantically on a ruggedized tablet, checking and rechecking the frequency modulation algorithms that would serve as their weapon. They were a motley crew of the obsolete and the forgotten. A disgraced pilot, a rogue journalist, and a blacklisted engineer, sailing toward a confrontation with the future. Their destination was the old Renton airfield, a decommissioned strip of cracked tarmac and rusted hangars that sat like a tombstone on the edge of the lake. It was a relic of the jet age, abandoned in favor of the shiny new logistics hubs, but it still held one piece of active history: the Doppler weather radar tower. It had been slated for demolition for years, a skeletal spire of steel rising 200 feet into the gloom, its emitter dish dormant, a sleeping giant waiting for a wake-up call. ETA 5 minutes. Elias's voice was barely audible over the wind, but it carried the weight of a command. Kenji, are you sure about the voltage? That old dish wasn't designed to pulse fire. I'm bypassing the safety regulators, Kenji shouted back, his voice cracking slightly. We're going to redline the magnetron. We'll get maybe 3 bursts of high-intensity signal before the capacitors blow. It has to be precise, Captain. We're painting a target the size of a dinner plate from a mile away. I don't miss, Elias muttered, more to himself than to them. They beached the skiff on a stretch of gravel and sawgrass just outside the airfield's perimeter fence. The silence here was profound, broken only by the lap of the water and the distant hum of the highway. Elias killed the engine, and for a moment they just sat there, the magnitude of what they were about to do settling over them like the heavy wet fog. This wasn't just a protest. It was a felony. It was sabotage. But as Elias looked at the towering cranes of the modern city across the water, seeing the blinking red lights of the construction drones hovering like fireflies, he knew it was necessary. The sky was being sold to the lowest bidder, and the currency was safety. Let's move, Sarah whispered, climbing out of the boat. They moved through the tall grass, finding the breach in the chain-link fence that Elias had scouted on satellite maps hours ago. The tower loomed ahead, a jagged silhouette against the low clouds. The climb was brutal. The service elevator had been dead for a decade, leaving only the external metal stairs that wound around the structure like a rusted spine. Elias took the lead, carrying the heavy battery pack, his bad knee screaming in protest with every step. He gritted his teeth, turning the pain into fuel. He thought of Mike. He thought of the recording. Tell Elias he was right. He wasn't doing this to be right. He was doing this so no one else had to die to prove a point. By the time they reached the control platform at the top, the wind was howling, a freezing gale that threatened to tear them from the grating. Below them, the city of Seattle was waking up. It was the morning of the Future of Freight Expo. At the convention center downtown, Julian Crest and the Apex Dynamics team were likely sipping espressos in a climate-controlled green room, preparing to unveil the Guardian drone fleet to a breathless world. They had permits, politicians, and PR firms. Elias had a bolt cutter and a hacked radar dish. "Hook it up," Elias ordered, leaning against the railing to catch his breath, his chest heaving. Kenji got to work, his fingers flying across the exposed wiring of the radar's junction box. He spliced the laptop into the ancient system, overriding the decay with digital urgency. Sarah stood watch, her camera raised, documenting the scene, not for a news report but for evidence. If they were arrested, She wanted the jury to see this, the desperate lengths required to tell the truth. "We have power," Kenji announced, the laptop screen casting a ghostly blue light on his face. "The dish is responsive. I've programmed the spoof. We're going to project a localized microburst signature simulated wind shear of 90 knots, straight down. If the Guardian code is running the X900 logic, it will panic. It will think it's falling out of the sky." "And the safety protocol?" Sarah asked, the wind whipping her hair across her face. "If the AI thinks the airframe is unrecoverable, the hardwired kernel, the part Apex couldn't delete, will trigger the ballistic parachutes," Elias answered, staring out toward the city. "They'll drift down, safe, slow, undeniable proof that the software is unstable." "And if they don't?" Sarah asked the question they had all been avoiding. "Then they crash," Elias said grimly. "But better they crash today into the empty bay than tomorrow into a school bus." The sun began to bleed through the gray clouds, a pale, watery light that offered no warmth. At the convention center, miles away across the water, the event was beginning. Elias raised his binoculars. He could see the stage set up on the pier, the gathered crowd, the news helicopters circling. And there, arranged in a perfect phalanx on the floating barge, were the drones. 50 of them, massive, six-rotor beasts painted in matte black, looking less like delivery vehicles and more like birds of prey. "They're spinning up," Elias said, the tension tightening his throat. Through the binoculars, he watched the rotors blur. The swarm lifted off in unison, a synchronized dance of terrifying precision. They rose to 300 feet, hovering in a formation so tight it looked like a single organism. The crowd on the pier cheered. Julian Crest was likely at the podium, talking about a new era of efficiency, about removing the human bottleneck. "Target locked," Kenji said, his hand hovering over the enter key. "They're entering the flight corridor. They're over the water. Wait, Captain, the lead drone is deviating. It's climbing. Showboating," Elias growled. "Crest is pushing the envelope. He wants to show how fast they can climb." "They're leaving the safe zone," Sarah warned, looking at the telemetry on Kenji's screen. "They're heading toward the ferry terminal. There are people there, Dad. We have to hit them now," Elias said. "Turn the dish. Azimuth 240. Elevation 10. The motor is seized," Kenji shouted, struggling with the rusted manual controls. "The gears are stripped. I can't traverse the dish." Elias threw down the binoculars. He grabbed a heavy iron pry bar from the floor. "Get out of the way." He jammed the bar into the gears of the massive radar mount. He wasn't a young man anymore. His back was stiff, his muscles atrophied from a year of retirement. But he threw his entire weight against the iron, groaning with exertion. "Move." The rust shrieked. The metal groaned. Slowly, agonizingly, the giant dish began to rotate. More. 5 more degrees. Kenji screamed, watching the drone swarm moving closer to the populated ferry terminal. Elias roared, a primal sound of effort, veins bulging in his neck. He felt something pop in his shoulder, a sharp, hot tear of a ligament, but he didn't stop. He pushed until his vision blurred. "Locked," Kenji yelled, firing in 3, 2, 1. Elias collapsed against the railing, gasping, clutching his shoulder. A low, vibrating hum filled the air, a sound not heard with the ears but felt in the teeth. The magnetron fired. An invisible cone of high-frequency energy shot out from the Renton Tower, racing across the water at the speed of light, carrying a digital lie designed to expose a physical truth. For a second, nothing happened. The drones continued their smooth, arrogant glide toward the city. Then chaos. The lead drone shuddered. To its sensors, the air pressure had just dropped catastrophically. The virtual wind was hitting it at 100 miles an hour. The X900 code, buried deep in its neural net, did exactly what Elias knew it would do. Panicked, prioritized airspeed over altitude, dove. And because they were a swarm, because they were slaves to the master link, they all dove. The formation shattered. 50 heavy-lift drones pitched nose down simultaneously, plummeting toward the water like stones. "Come on," Elias whispered, watching the fall. "Deploy. Deploy, you bastards." They fell. 500 feet. 400. 300. The crowd on the pier screamed. The perfect demonstration had turned into a mass suicide dive. At 200 feet, the hardwired logic kicked in. The proximity sensors realized the ground was rushing up too fast, overruling the faulty air data. Po-pee, pop, pop, pop. Orange silk blossomed across the gray sky. 50 ballistic parachutes deployed in a cascading wave of color. The violent descent was arrested instantly. The drones jerked, swung, and then drifted gently, harmlessly, down to the surface of Elliott Bay. Splash, splash, splash. They bobbed in the water like confused ducks, their rotors slowly spinning down to a halt. The threat was neutralized. The future of freight was floating in the harbor, dead in the water. On the tower, there was no cheering, just the heavy sound of breathing and the wind whistling through the grating. "We did it," Kenji breathed, slumped over his laptop. The data log shows the error code. It's all there. Sarah lowered her camera. She walked over to Elias, who was sitting on the metal floor, holding his arm. She knelt down and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his neck. She was shaking, but this time it wasn't from cold. "You got them down, Dad," she sobbed. "You brought them home." Elias looked at the orange parachutes dotting the bay, bright spots of safety in a gray world. He felt the pain in his shoulder, the ache in his knees, the exhaustion in his soul. But beneath it all, he felt a quiet, profound stillness. "Not me," Elias whispered, patting her back with his good hand. "We did." The sound of sirens began to rise from the base of the tower. Blue lights flashed against the rusted steel. The police were here. Trespassing. Vandalism. Maybe worse. "They're coming up," Kenji said, closing his laptop. "I wiped the drive. They can't trace the spoof back to us technically, but we're the only ones here." "Let them come," Elias said, struggling to stand up. Sarah helped him, supporting his weight. He adjusted his jacket, straightened his collar. He wasn't going to be dragged down those stairs. He was going to walk. "Sarah," Elias said, looking her in the eye. "You have the footage?" "Yes." "You have the chip?" "Yes." "Then the story is yours. I'm just the distraction." When the tactical team burst onto the platform, weapons drawn, shouting commands, they didn't find a group of terrorists. They found an old man standing at the railing, looking out at the city he had saved, flanked by his daughter and a young engineer. Elias Thorne raised his hands slowly, not in surrender, but in a gesture of peace. The aftermath was not a trial, but a reckoning. Apex Dynamics tried to spin it. Julian Crest went on television claiming it was a terrorist cyber attack that caused the crash. But Sarah Thorne's report aired that night. She showed the code. She showed the connection to the X-900. She showed the footage of the drones diving in unison, driven by the same flawed logic that had killed Mike. The public didn't buy the spin. The image of 50 heavy drones falling out of the sky over a major city was too visceral. The Guardian program was grounded indefinitely. Julian Crest resigned in disgrace 2 days later. Elias spent a night in a holding cell, but the charges didn't stick. The malfunction of the old radar tower was ruled accidental, a convenient bureaucratic lie facilitated by a few quiet phone calls from the same FBI agents who had arrested Vane. They knew. Everyone knew. 3 months later, the summer had finally come to Seattle, burning away the gray mist and turning the Puget Sound into a sheet of glittering sapphire. Elias walked slowly down the dock of the marina, his shoulders still stiff but healing. He carried a small cardboard box. He reached the end of the pier, where a simple wooden bench had been installed. A small brass plaque on the backrest read, "In memory of Captain Michael Henderson, who kept flying." Elias sat down. He opened the box. Inside was a model plane, a vintage carved wood P-51 Mustang that he and Mike had built together in their spare time between flights, decades ago. It had sat in Elias's attic for years, unfinished. Now it was painted, polished, and perfect. You always liked the classics, Mike, Elias said to the empty air. He placed the model on the bench. He sat there for a long time watching the seagulls wheel and dive. He thought about the nature of machines. They were faster now, smarter, capable of calculations he couldn't dream of. But they couldn't feel the yoke shudder in their hands. They couldn't feel the fear that sharpened focus. They couldn't make the choice to sacrifice themselves to save a neighborhood. That was the human burden. And the human glory. Footsteps approached on the wood planks. Light, purposeful steps. Sarah sat down beside him. She didn't say anything at first, just leaned her head on his shoulder. She was holding a tablet. The Henderson Act passed the Senate this morning, she said softly. Unanimous vote. No autonomous system can carry passengers or heavy freight over populated areas without a human pilot in the loop. Physical overrides are mandatory. Elias nodded, watching the waves. It won't last forever, you know. They'll try again. 10 years, 20 years. They'll say the tech is ready. And we'll be there, Sarah said. Or someone like us will be. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small velvet box. She opened it. Inside was a pin, a pair of golden wings worn and scratched. I found these in your drawer, she said. You haven't worn them since the trial. Elias looked at the wings, his captain's wings, the symbol of 40 years of service. I'm retired, Sarah. I don't need them. You're not retired, Dad, she said, pinning them onto the lapel of his jacket. You just changed your flight path. You're the lighthouse now. You stay on the ground so others can see where the rocks are. Elias touched the cool metal of the wings. He looked at his daughter, seeing the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the same stubborn set of the jaw that he saw in the mirror every morning. He realized then that he hadn't just saved a city or grounded a fleet. He had raised a successor. He stood up, the pain in his joints a little less sharp today. He looked up at the sky. A commercial airliner was tracing a high arc toward the east, gleaming in the sun. It was flying straight and true, carried by the hands of a pilot who was awake, alert, and in control. Elias took a deep breath of the salty air, filling his lungs. The storm was over. The radar was silent. The sky was clear. Come on, Elias said, offering his arm to his daughter. Let's go home. I think there's a game on and you still owe me a beer. Sarah smiled, linking her arm through his. You're on, Captain. They walked back down the pier together, two silhouettes against the brightness of the water, leaving the bench and the wooden plane behind them. A quiet monument to the ones who fell and a promise to the ones still flying.